Welcome to Shockorama, your source for all things shock, schlock, and just plain bizarre. I'm Ben Sherman, and today we're going to be looking at the 1971 film Dracula vs. Frankenstein. Frankenstein's monster is my favorite of the original Universal monsters, and this is going to be the first in a three-part series covering a couple of adaptations of Frankenstein made in the 70s. All three movies I'm covering are going to be surreal, gory, and very fun for fans of 70s exploitation. Dracula vs. Frankenstein was directed by Al Adamson, a prolific director of B-movies throughout the 60s and 70s. His parents were both actors, and his father was a star and producer of silent films. Adamson appeared in his first film in 1935 at the age of just 5 or 6, in a movie that was directed by his father. In 1961, Adamson was an uncredited co-director alongside his father for the film Halfway to Hell, and decided then that he wanted to work full-time in the film industry. His father introduced him to Sam Sherman, then an aspiring film distributor, and the two young men began a long partnership, working on numerous films together throughout the 60s and 70s. In 1969, they founded Independent International Pictures together, and many of Adamson's future films would be distributed by them, including Dracula vs. Frankenstein. 1969 was also the year when Adamson met his future wife and the star of several of his future films, Regina Carroll. Carroll was working as a waitress at a coffee shop that Adamson stopped at, and when she heard that he was a film director, she spilled some coffee on his lap to get his attention. Regina Carroll would star in his 1969 film Satan's Sadists, and then in 1971 she was in two of his films, Brain of Blood and Dracula vs. Frankenstein. The two got married in 1972. Regina Carroll sadly passed away from cancer in 1992, and her husband died 3 years later. I just wanted to give a quick warning here that I will be briefly going over the circumstances of Al Adamson's death, so if anyone is squeamish around discussions of true crime, you may want to skip ahead to the timestamp I show on screen. I do cover a lot of dark subject matter on this channel, but at the end of the day, everything that happens in these movies is fiction. It's important to understand that when these acts of violence happen in real life, real people are affected, and there should be no judgment if anyone involved or otherwise has a strong emotional reaction to hearing about these kinds of tragedies. In 1995, Adamson had hired a live-in contractor to make some repairs on his house. He gave the contractor a credit card to make necessary purchases, and the contractor very quickly overspent it, leading to several altercations between the two. The last of these altercations turned out to be fatal, and the contractor then hid Adamson's body underneath tile and concrete in a spot where a hot tub had just been removed. The murder was discovered when Adamson's housekeeper became suspicious of his absence and filed a police report, leading to the discovery of his body and the arrest of the contractor. Regina Carroll and Al Adamson were by all accounts lovely people, and I'd just like to take a moment to show a couple clips of their former collaborators and friends remembering them.
Al was so great. He was just smiling all the time. And I'm feeling a little something remembering when Sam actually called me years later and told me what happened. I remembered what a fine human being he was. Gina was a delight, as sweet as can be. A little story about Gina. When they invited me out to their place in Palm Springs one weekend, we went out there, and then Gina was going to make dinner, and Al and I were shooting hoops. They had a court out there where he lived. And he kept saying, "Wait till you taste this. What is it?" Well, she calls it schlum goo. I said, "What is it?" And she said, No, it's her specialty. Wait till you do this." And so we went in, we sit down, they open a bottle of white wine, and Gina takes a casserole dish out and serves up canned tuna, canned peas, and noodles mixed together, and that was schlum goo. That was her specialty, and I loved her for it.
Dracula vs. Frankenstein was actually first filmed in 1969 under a different title, or multiple different titles. I found a couple sources that couldn't seem to agree on whether it was originally called The Bloodseekers or Blood Freaks the Bloodsuckers. At this stage, the movie did not include Dracula or Frankenstein, and the plot was apparently much more centered around the character Rico and his biker gang. Sam Sherman didn't like this original version of the movie very much, so it sat dormant for about a year until they decided to do some reshoots and add the Dracula and Frankenstein plotline. You can still kind of tell that this was two separate films at points in the movie, especially with the police missing persons search plotline that just doesn't really go anywhere. What we're left with is a real Frankenstein's monster of a film. Am I right? The movie starts with the coolest opening credits sequence ever. Just look at that lightning coming out of Dracula's hands. Damn! The film's soundtrack was composed by William Lava, a prolific composer with a very long list of production credits. I did learn that he composed music for Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies, which I think is really cool. In his commentary for the film, Sam Sherman says that William Lava composed the entire score back when the film was still just called The Bloodseekers. So when production began again for Dracula vs. Frankenstein, Sherman had wanted to make a couple edits to the music cues. Unfortunately, William Lava had passed away in February of 1971, so Sherman had to go and re-edit some of the music cues himself. Either way, I think the music perfectly fits the cheesy B-movie vibe of the rest of the film, and I'm really glad that the Blu-ray copy I got came with this neat little CD of the soundtrack. After the credits end, we get an establishing shot of Oakmore Cemetery late at night. We see a cloaked figure opening a casket with a really gnarly looking body inside. As you might have guessed already, this is the body of Frankenstein's monster, who was played for most of the film by John Bloom. At the time of filming, Bloom was working as the department manager at a computerized tax company. Apparently, he would work 12-hour days at the tax company, then drive over to Hollywood to shoot the film, leaving very little time to sleep. During this opening scene, he was actually fast asleep inside the coffin, and when the assistant director woke him up afterwards, he had no idea that they had already filmed the scene. The cemetery caretaker comes out to investigate, and we see that the cloaked figure is actually Dracula. Dracula kills the caretaker by sucking his blood. Little fun fact, that caretaker was actually played by Regina Carroll's real-life father. The credits introduce Dracula's actor as Zandor Vorkov, but the actor's real name is Raphael Peter Engel. Engel was given the name Zandor Vorkov by Forrest J. Ackerman, who was famous as the editor and co-founder of the horror magazine Famous Monsters of Filmland. Ackerman took the name Zandor from Anton Zandor LaVey, who was the founder of the Church of Satan, and Vorkov was inspired by Boris Karloff, who of course played the monster in the original Frankenstein from 1931. Next, we see a beachside carnival at night. This was likely the original opening shot, filmed in 1969 before the reshoots. We see a young woman walk down off the boardwalk and onto the very foggy beach, where the soundtrack immediately starts getting over-the-top scary. An unseen assailant attacks the woman with an axe, and her severed head rolls in the sand. The movie cuts to Las Vegas, where a sign tells us that Judith Fontaine is performing. We see Judith, played by Regina Carroll, performing an extremely fun song that is also extremely dissonant with the tone of the rest of the movie.
My gosh! I forgot my clothes! Wow!
We also get a quick cameo by director Al Adamson, sitting in the audience and watching his wife perform. After the song ends, Judith goes to visit Sergeant Martin at the Missing Persons Bureau. We learn from a telegram she received at the theater that her younger sister Joni is missing. Sergeant Martin warns Judith not to look for her sister on her own, saying that the area that Joni disappeared in is known to be very dangerous.
Yeah, it's a dark, dark world, Miss Fontaine.
Back at the carnival, we see a hippie couple getting lured into an exhibit by a carny, played by the legendary Angelo Rosito. Angelo Rosito starred in more than 60 films between 1927 and 1987, with some of his more notable appearances including Todd Browning's 1932 horror classic, Freaks, and the 1987 film Mad Max Beyond the Thunderdome. He also starred in several films alongside Bela Lugosi, who of course played Dracula in the 1931 Universal film, and he starred alongside the man of a thousand faces himself, Lon Chaney, whose son, Lon Chaney Jr., also appears in Dracula vs. Frankenstein. The carny leads the couple into the dark and empty-looking exhibit. A couple scenes of horror are lighted up, including one featuring cinematographer Gary Graver's wife and son. Graver is a fascinating figure who worked on numerous B-movies throughout the 70s. During the filming for Dracula vs. Frankenstein, he was also actively working with Orson Welles on his film The Other Side of the Wind, which wouldn't see a release until 2018. Graver also worked with Welles on the films F for Fake and Filming Othello. Getting back to the movie, it's unclear to me what exactly these tableaus are supposed to be. It seems like they're supposed to be animatronics and dummies, but some of them are very obviously played by actual human actors, while others, like the guillotine scene, are obviously dummies. We don't have a lot of time to think about this though, because pretty soon Dr. Duray, the creator of the attraction, rolls out of the shadows to deliver a creepy, if hard-to-follow monologue. Speaking of hard to follow, I have yet another sidebar about this actor, and I will have a couple more coming up. And no, I am not sorry about it. Dr. Duray was played by J. Carrol Naish, a legendary actor from Hollywood's golden age, who at this point in his career had over 200 film and TV credits under his belt. And he was even honored with his own star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Sadly, Dracula vs. Frankenstein would be his final appearance on screen, and he passed away in January 1973 from emphysema. We also finally see Lon Chaney Jr. in this scene, playing Groton, Dr. Duray's assistant. And as promised, here is yet another sidebar about yet another legendary actor who's just randomly in this low-budget exploitation flick. Lon Chaney Jr. was famous as an icon of early Universal horror films. Perhaps most well known for his portrayal of Larry Talbot, the titular werewolf in the 1941 film The Wolfman. He also played Lenny in the 1939 film adaptation of Mice and Men, a role which co-stars and crew members have said they could see echoes of in his portrayal of Groton here. Unfortunately, as with J. Carrol Naish, this would also be Lon Chaney Jr.'s final film appearance, and he died just a couple months after Naish in July of 1973 from heart disease after decades of smoking and alcohol abuse. Rest in peace. When Chaney began filming for this movie in 1969, it was decided early on that Groton would be a mute when Adamson and Sam Sherman discovered that Chaney was only capable of producing a hoarse whisper at this point in his life. But on a lighter note, the puppy that Groton plays with and cares for throughout the film is really cute. And he was played by the brother of director Al Adamson's dog, which he often brought to set with him when directing his movies. As the hippie couple leaves, they have some really funny dialogue, which I think was the director's not-so-subtle commentary on the hippie movement.
Come on, let's get ready for the big protest tonight.
What are we protesting tonight?
I don't know, but I'll bet it's fun.
Dr. Duray uses an elevator to get to the hidden laboratory below his exhibit, which characters throughout the film keep referring to as a creature emporium, but let's be real, 5 tableaus of mostly just humans does not count as a creature emporium to me. Groton has prepared the lab for Dr. Duray, which consists of having a naked woman on a table with a sheet over her, and another naked woman standing inside a glass coffin thing. I don't know why she's in there. I don't know if Dr. Duray knows why she's in there. Like many things in this film, it is never explained. It turns out the woman on the table is the one that we saw get beheaded at the start of the film, and Dr. Duray has sewn her head back on and brought her back to life. It sounds familiar. Sort of like...
Dr. Frankenstein.
No. Maybe I'm wrong. Let's not jump to conclusions. Groton moves the woman off the table and into her own glass coffin thing, and then he jumps up on the table, and Duray gives him an injection of some kind of serum which has a obvious, non-specific transformative effect on it. Duray then sends Groton down to the beach through a trapdoor in the floor.
Don't wander away from the pier. We all wait for you, Groton. Walk silent and walk well.
Duray wheels away from the lab, but is stopped by Dracula. Duray brings up some good points and asks some very good questions.
What do you want? It's late. And my exhibit is closed, and how did you get in here anyway?
But Dracula just waves him off.
Oh, that is unimportant, Doctor.
Because no one wants to explain anything in this damn movie. Dracula says he knows Duray's secret, so Duray agrees to speak with him in his lab. There, Dracula reveals that Duray is actually the last living descendant of
Dr. Frankenstein.
I knew it! And Duray reveals that Dracula is Dracula. Dracula then introduces an extremely interesting plotline that I promise is definitely explained and fleshed out later. Just trust me, guys. Duray had apparently been previously discredited by a group of scientists when they found out he was a descendant of Frankenstein. And then those same scientists had apparently caused some kind of accident which had injured Duray and is why he uses a wheelchair. Dracula tells Duray that he can get his revenge as long as he agrees to follow his orders. Then Dracula lights... Is that a shirt? I think he just lit a shirt on fire. Duray is evidently very impressed by Dracula's shirt burning abilities, so he agrees to follow his orders. Out on the beach, we get to see Groton at work as he stalks a couple making out under the boardwalk. The man looks like he's 40, the woman looks like she's 20, but Groton doesn't discriminate based on age, and he kills both of them with his axe. Next, we cut to a protest in the streets. I don't know what they're protesting, but it looks fun. We see Judith enter some kind of coffee shop or bar thing, and she asks a man with a stitched up head if he knows where her sister is. He says he doesn't, so she asks if he knows about a guy named Rico, which he also says he doesn't. But then we see him go up and start talking to Rico, so we know he's a dirty liar. Rico doesn't like that this woman is asking questions about him, so he has Head Stitch guy spike her drink with LSD. Judith starts tripping and freaking out, and we get this really weird sequence where there's all these cutaway shots to her in what looks like some kind of psychedelic burlesque show. Eventually, the couple from the Creature Emporium walks in, and they take Judith away. Back in Duray's lab, we see Dracula has brought the monster's body, and they've hooked it up to all the machinery. Some of the gadgets and gizmos you see in this scene are original creations for the film created with junk electronics that the crew could find, but a couple of the machines were the actual props created by Kenneth Strickfaden for the original 1931 Frankenstein. Apparently, the crew had some trouble getting all of these machines to work properly, so some of these close-ups that you see were taken in Kenneth Strickfaden's house. This scene also introduces this weird connection between the monster and this comet that apparently passed by Earth when the monster was first reanimated, and now the comet is passing by Earth again, so that's why Dracula wants to reanimate him again now. It's honestly the least developed part of the film, and I have no idea what's happening, but as long as we've got Frankenstein's monster walking around, I'm happy. I keep going back and forth on whether or not I like the monster's makeup. Sometimes I think it looks really cool and gnarly, and it's all like half mummified. Other times I think it just looks kind of goofy. We cut to Dr. Beaumont, the main scientist responsible for humiliating Dr. Duray, as he's getting into his car outside the hospital. Beaumont is played by Forrest J. Ackerman, who, as I had previously mentioned, was famous within the horror community for co-founding and editing the magazine Famous Monsters of Filmland, a magazine that was legendary and inspired numerous other genre-themed magazines such as Fangoria, Castle of Frankenstein, and Cinema Fantastique. Dracula magically appears in the car next to Beaumont, which Beaumont takes remarkably well, and then follows Dracula's directions. Dracula leads him down to a secluded road where the monster is waiting for him, and then instructs Beaumont to get out of the car. Beaumont's reaction is so funny. He's just like, oh well, alright. If I have to. The monster quickly crushes Beaumont to death. Back in the movie's other plotline, Judith wakes up in the house of some guy in his 40s who wears love beads. He introduces himself as Mike, and it turns out that he actually knew Joni, though he doesn't know where she is now. Mike leads Judith outside, and it turns out his house is right on the beach. We see the hippie couple that rescued Judith playing in the sand, and Mike introduces them as Samantha and Strange.
That's his name, also classification.
Then out of nowhere, this random guy just runs up and shouts up to Mike about this body that was found murdered with an axe on the beach.
I can't make out in peace anymore. Man, it's a real bummer.
Fun fact, this random guy is played by cinematographer Gary Graver. And this is the only shot in the movie where the camera was being operated by co-writer and production supervisor Sam Sherman. Mike tells Judith that her sister apparently hung out a lot at Duray's Creature Emporium. They decide to go with Strange and Samantha back to the Emporium to try asking Duray some questions. There's a quick shot while they're standing outside the Emporium where in the background you can see Angelo Rosito speaking with Al Adamson's father, which I just thought was really neat. They go inside and meet Dr. Duray. After showing him a picture of Joni, Duray claims not to recognize her face, but he makes a really big reaction when he sees the picture, so Judith knows that he's lying. As they leave, Samantha and Strange have a run-in with Rico and his biker gang. Rico implies that him and Samantha have some kind of previous relationship with each other. Things are about to get violent, but then Sergeant Martin shows up in his police car and scares the bikers away. Sergeant Martin has a frustrating conversation with Judith where he says there's basically no point doing anything about the bikers and that Samantha can take care of herself. He tells Judith again to stop looking for her sister, and then he just disappears from the movie for about 40 minutes. Judith actually decides to take Sergeant Martin's advice, and she and Mike decide to have a romantic montage on the beach. We're having a montage on the beach. Yeah, we're having a montage on the beach. It's time to have a romantic subplot, because that's just what we're doing in this movie. Back in the part of the movie where stuff is actually happening. Dr. Duray is drawing blood from another one of his undead victims when Groton starts having a transformation, despite not having been given the serum in over 24 hours. Duray is very annoyed by this and chastises Groton because he has to waste some of his special serum that he's making with the blood in order to stop Groton's transformation. Judith and Mike finally remember that they're in a horror movie, so they finish up their beach montage and decide to investigate the boardwalk underneath Dr. Duray's creature emporium. Meanwhile, the monster sneaks up on a couple making out in their car. He kills the man and kidnaps the woman, and when a pair of police officers show up, he shows off his Frankenstein foo and kills both of them. Now this is the cheesiness that I came to this movie for. Judith meets Mike under the boardwalk that night, and the two of them find a chain leading up to the trapdoor that Groton uses to sneak out and commit his murders. While the two of them decide to just sit on the sand and do nothing for a bit, in a different part of the beach, Samantha gets attacked by Rico and his cronies. Groton sneaks up behind and kills all four of them with his axe before taking Samantha back up to the lab. Judith and Mike find Samantha's locket underneath the trapdoor. Mike runs up to the Emporium, dodging past the carny. Judith follows, and the carny tells her that her friend is waiting for her, and then he starts maniacally laughing as she enters. Mike and Judith make it to Duray's secret lab, and Duray tells them over loudspeakers that he's only allowed them to get this far so that they understand why he's chosen to make them part of his experiment. I think he's doing a bad job though, because I don't understand any of what he's doing. Groton blocks the door behind them, and we see that the carny has come down to watch. Duray tells them that witnessing the death of a loved one causes a change in the blood to happen that makes it elevated or something. I really have no idea what he's talking about. It seems clear to me that this was a plot line that was from the original iteration of the film when it was still the Bloodseekers, and it very clearly did not make it intact to the final release. Anyways, Groton starts attacking Mike. The carny cheers on Groton for a bit, but then he falls through the open trap door, landing face first on an axe. Duray starts shooting at Mike, and Groton chases Judith out of the room. Mike manages to escape upstairs into the exhibit room, and Duray follows him through the elevator. Meanwhile, we see that Strange has dragged Sergeant Martin out from whatever rock he was hiding under, and the two of them have correctly assumed that Mike and Judith must be in trouble at the Creature Emporium. Duray searches for Mike through the dark exhibit until he runs out of ammo, and then he just rolls himself into the guillotine, which decapitates him. I mean, the special effects for his decapitated head are pretty great and all, but it just feels like such an anticlimactic way for one of the main antagonists of the movie to get killed off. Meanwhile, Groton has followed Judith up onto the roof of the building. Strange and Sergeant Martin see Groton running around from the ground, and Sergeant Martin shoots at him, killing him. Groton falls from the roof and lands on the ground, and there's a really sad shot of the puppy sniffing at his face. This scene also feels especially sad to me just because of the context of it being Lon Chaney Jr.'s final film appearance, and knowing what poor physical and mental health he was in during filming. Just when she thinks she's safe, Dracula appears from behind Judith and hypnotizes her. He leads her to a different area and ties her up against a railing, just as the monster comes out from the shadows to terrify her. Dracula wanted this to happen so that her blood would be elevated or something, whatever Duray was trying to do. Luckily, Mike finds them and distracts the monster with a flare just long enough to untie Judith so they can make their escape. This is cut short, however, when Dracula zaps Mike from behind, disintegrating him. Judith faints, and the iconic monsters take her away. They take her to an abandoned church so that Dracula can drink her blood and maybe turn her into a vampire too, it seems like. After tying her up, Dracula goes off to monologue to himself at his coffin, which turns out to be a bad idea because while he's gone, the monster develops a crush on Judith. When Dracula comes back, the monster fights him off from Judith and knocks his magic ring off of his finger in the process. They take the fight outside, where Dracula eventually manages to get the upper hand and rips off both of the monster's arms, and then finishes him off by ripping his head off. This whole segment at the abandoned church featured Shelley Weiss, not John Bloom, in the monster makeup. I couldn't find much information about why exactly they recast him, but it seems like the most likely reason is because the abandoned church was located in New York, and John Bloom probably just couldn't make the trip out. From Sam Sherman's commentary, it sounds like John Bloom was just really invested in his tax agency job at the time. Dracula may have defeated the monster, but when he looks up, he sees that the sun is coming up, and he realizes the fight took too long. Desperately, he tries to get back to the safety of his coffin, but he's too late, and he collapses on a broken door in front of the church, where his face melts in an elaborate, if cheap-looking effect. For this scene, Al Adamson just had Zandor Vorkov lay down on a door, left the camera rolling, and had the crew continually apply more and more makeup to his face until eventually replacing the actor with a fake skull and some dust. It's not a great effect, but there's something about it that I just really love, and it's one of the more memorable parts of the movie for me. Judith has escaped from her bonds, and as she carefully steps around Dracula's remains, we get a lovely little montage of all the friends she made along the way. Maybe the real Dracula versus Frankenstein was in here all along. And that is how the movie ends. This movie is a real experience to watch. Does it make sense? No. Are the acting performances good? No. Is it a good movie? No. Should you watch it? Absolutely. There's something just so special about these kinds of movies. It exists in this magical sweet spot where everyone working on it understood the limitations they were under and made the most out of it. You can really feel the passion for filmmaking through the screen. Dracula vs. Frankenstein feels like a love letter to classic horror movies, made at the start of a shift in the genre away from the gothic stories of Universal and Hammer films towards sleazier, grittier, gorier movies. This came out just a year before Wes Craven's groundbreaking debut, Last House on the Left, and 3 years before one of the most influential horror films of the 70s, and a personal favorite of mine, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Dracula vs. Frankenstein is in some ways a transition out of the cheesy horror icons of the past into the uglier, more contemporary style that the genre is known for today. This is especially apparent when you take into account the presence of horror icons like J. Carrol Naish, Lon Chaney Jr., and Angelo Rosito. All three of them acting as sort of elderly statesmen of old horror, welcoming in the coming new horror movement. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. It was so great seeing how much people liked my last video, and it feels really good to know that people are enjoying what I'm doing on this channel. As I said at the beginning, this is going to be the first in a 3-part series on early 70s adaptations of Frankenstein. For the next video, we're going to be traveling to Italy to see a more Giallo-inspired take on the monster. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more like it, don't forget to like and subscribe. Until next time, stay weird.